So let's delve a little deeper in the cardiac output times heart rate, or the cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume formula. Because this is a very important formula, as you can see from the last video, because you can play with these variables and it can affect how the heart is working with every single beat. Another formula is the VO2 max formula, which we'll go over in a second. But let's just dive a little deeper into how these values change during submaximal exercise and maximal. And submaximal will be like you're working around, it's around like 60 to 50% of your VO2. That's an intensity. So you're not really working that hard. It's like for a runner, you're just jogging, or like if you're just jogging a mile or something very easy, but you're obviously exercising, but you're not at your max. Whereas maximal would be like 70 to 100% of VO2. You're working pretty hard, you're sweating, all that stuff. So this one will look specifically at what happens during submaximal and maximal, regardless if you're trained or untrained. So first one is looking at cardiac output times heart rate times stroke volume. What happens during submax and maximal? We know cardiac output increases whenever you start exercising, regardless. Because when you start exercising, so I guess we'll explain what happens when you're at rest. So when you're at rest, your body, or your heart pumps a certain amount of blood, and every single organ needs blood. Now, certain organs need more blood than other organs when you're at rest, such as your muscles don't need as much blood as they do when you exercise. So the arteries going to your muscles vasoconstrict, which this means the arteries going to your muscle get smaller, and they don't allow as much blood to get to the muscle, which makes sense because you're resting, you don't need a lot of blood to your muscle. And then what this does is the rest of that blood, because you still have 5 liters of blood circulating your body at rest, the rest of the blood is going to other active organs that aren't as active during rest, such as your kidneys, your gallbladder, your digestive system, your liver. All these unactive organs, or all these organs are very active when you're resting, but when you're exercising, they're not that active. So most of the blood is going to your kidneys, your liver, of course your brain, your heart, but your digestive system. So that's where most of the blood is going at rest. And thus the arteries are vasoconstricted, going to your muscles because they don't need that much blood. And then when you start exercising, this ratio shifts because you need more blood to your muscles. So now your muscles will start to vasodilate, or the arteries to your muscles will vasodilate, and blood will go to the muscles because they need all the blood. And then blood in the less active organs will vasoconstrict, or arteries in the less active organs will vasoconstrict, so less blood will go to your kidneys, your digestive system, and everything, and your liver, because you really don't need. You're not digesting food when you're exercising, when you're running. Your kidneys aren't really working that much when you're running to filter and pee out water and everything. So those are less active organs. Your body has better use of the blood and muscles. So this is a ratio. So when you start exercising, more blood will go to your muscles. And to do that, your vasodilate, vasoconstrict, your change, and your cardiac output will increase. So erase that. So we know when you start exercising, your cardiac output increases. We know your heart rate will increase. And we know your stroke volume will increase. We all know these things. Your heart rate obviously increases when you start exercising, your stroke volume increases. But what is the extent where each one increases? Because depending if you're submax or you're maximal, either your stroke volume will increase more or your heart rate will increase more. Well, we have this little graph, and never mind the numbers. The numbers aren't too important to know, but this just shows what happens during submax and max. This is considered submaximal, and then the heart rate after this is considered max. So this is considered maximal exercise. This is considered submax. So what this shows is stroke volume increases more during submax exercise. So when you first start exercising, before you reach submax, which submax is usually, depending on what number he uses, but it's usually 50% or 60% of your VO2. Or 40% to 60% of your VO2. It depends what number he says, but submax is like around 50% of your VO2. And before you reach submax, your stroke volume contributed to the greatest increase in your cardiac output, because your cardiac output increases regardless. It's during exercise, but your stroke volume increases much more than your heart rate. And everyone knows this. When you first start exercising, your heart rate doesn't automatically spike up and increase exponentially like it is here. It increases slowly, but your stroke volume increases much more greatly at submax. And then when you cross this like 50% threshold, your heart rate spikes up, and then your stroke volume like stagnates, remains the same. and your heart rate spikes up. And now the heart rate is what, now at this point, because your cardiac output still keeps increasing past 50% of your VO2 or past submax, but your heart rate is now contributing the greatest increase. So your submax, your stroke volume increases first, and then your cardiac output increases. So you can erase that. And I believe that's all you need to know about cardiac output. First, your stroke volume increases up to 50 to 60% of your VO2, or depending on what number he says, and then your heart rate will increase exponentially after that. So your heart rate increases slowly at first, but your cardiac output increases as it shows. Your cardiac output always increases. This 25 and 30 probably isn't happening unless you're an elite athlete, but your cardiac output, your stroke volume increases, and then it stagnates, and then your heart rate takes over. So that's very important to note. During submax, your stroke volume it contributes the greatest increase, and then your heart rate contributes the greatest increase past submax. And we'll talk about why that is in some other videos, not this video. Now, the second formula is really the same thing as the third formula, if the people who have the study guide questions or whatever, but it's just the Fick equation. The Fick equation is very important, not just in exercise physiology, it's very important in the medical community and everything. It's just VO2 equals cardiac output times AV difference. And this is always abbreviated different. I'm just going to put it as A parentheses V. And this is the Fick equation. So this is very important to know. I'm sure there's going to be a question. It's going to be very simple. What is the Fick equation? And just answer it. Now this is the same exact thing as the next equation. It's just rearranged differently. So it's just simple math. But this is the Fick equation. Cardiac output, we know, is the total amount of blood circulating your body every minute. So it's how much blood your heart pumps out in a minute span. Greater with exercise. VO2 is how much oxygen your muscles can utilize, depending on how much blood you pumped out. So because not all the oxygen your body pumps out, your body uses all of it. It's not as efficient as you think. It's not 100% efficient. So say you have every minute you pump out 100, or every minute with cardiac output. Or say like during one heartbeat you pump out 20 milliliters of oxygen. Well, that's not the units, but you're pumping out 20 microliters, or you're pumping out 20 units of oxygen in this cardiac output. Your body only takes up some of that. It doesn't take up all of it. It's not as efficient. So the higher your cardiac output is, the higher your VO2 is, that means the more efficient your body is at using oxygen. So this is always used as the benchmark of cardiorespiratory fitness. This is a very important number. Using it in medical communities, the higher your VO2 is, the more in shape you are cardiovascular-wise. And once it gets really low, like below 20, that's when they can start predicting your prognosis of how long you have to live. It's that important. Because if you have a VO2 of like 10, that's extremely low. That means your body is very inefficient at taking up oxygen, and you probably don't have too much longer to live because you can't utilize as much oxygen as you have. Most people is between like 30 and 40 for sedentary individuals, which is normal. And that's a good number, but that means your body can only use around 30 to 40 milliliters of oxygen per minute. It's not as much. Now for elite athletes, it gets to like 60, 70, 80, and that means they're much more efficient at using oxygen. So this is a very, very important number. This is why whenever you look at elite runners, they always measure them in like VO2s and how high is their VO2 and everything. But this is the Fick equation. And what this equation is simply saying, you can just break down the values. VO2 equals cardiac output. We know what cardiac output is. Cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So what this shows simply is if you increase heart rate, you increase stroke volume, if you increase the intensity of exercise, your VO2 will increase, which makes sense. The more intense an exercise is, the more oxygen your body needs going to use from that blood, because it needs more oxygen the more intense it is. So that just shows with increasing intensity, you increase your VO2. Now AV difference, this is a tough concept to understand, but AV difference is how much oxygen your body actually utilizes. So it's the oxygen content in your arteries minus the oxygen content in your veins. Now remember, arteries are going away from the heart, and then veins are going towards the heart, and capillaries are in between these. So capillaries will be like right here. Now in capillaries is where you have gas exchange, where you take up the oxygen. You don't take any oxygen in the arteries, or you don't take any in the veins. You take it all in the capillaries. So say, to play with some numbers, and I think these are the true numbers he uses, but the amount of oxygen is measured in deciliters, but we'll just say 20. So you have 20 units of oxygen in the arteries that you pump out. pumped from your aorta. It pumped out 20 milliliters of oxygen, or 20 units of oxygen in that blood. Now, say in the capillaries, it goes throughout the body in the arteries. And once it gets to the capillaries only take 5 of that. It's never going to take 100% of it. It's not that efficient. So it only takes 5 liters. It only takes 5 units of that oxygen. So the other 15 units will go back into the veins and go back into the heart. So what this means is you only took 5. Your AV difference is only 5. So your artery content minus your venous content was only 5. So what that means is your body only used 5 units of oxygen out of the valuable 20. So it wasn't as efficient because it didn't need as much oxygen. You're probably resting at this point. So your AV difference was only 5. Now say you start exercising, and now if you're still pumping out 20, you're not going to pump out any more oxygen, probably, up to an extent. So say you're still pumping out 20, but now instead of taking 5, your capillaries realize they need more oxygen because your body demands it. So it's going to uptake of much more oxygen. It's going to respond to the demand and take more oxygen. So now you take 15 deciliters. So now you're only returning 5 back to your heart. So now your AV difference is 15. And this is a common. This usually insinuates you're exercising. If your AV difference is much higher, you're exercising because your body needs much more oxygen. And this is completely normal. You don't really do anything with training. This just happens in response to exercise. Your body realizes it needs more oxygen, so it uptakes more oxygen. And as you can see from this equation, if you increase AV difference, you increase your VO2. If you increase cardiac output, you increase your VO2. So really, you can play with any of these numbers. The point of training is to increase your stroke volume. You increase your stroke volume, you increase your VO2. Training isn't going to increase your heart rate because your max heart rate, of course, is set at birth. It always decreases with age, but you do increase it slower. And the point of training is to increase your cardiac output. That increases exponentially when you train. So thus you increase your VO2 exponentially. And your AV difference doesn't really increase with training. It just increases with exercise. So like if you take an unfit athlete and a fit athlete isn't more efficient at taking up more oxygen in the capillaries. That just happens with your body. They might be a little bit more efficient, but it's not to a great extent. But your VO2 will be much greater with a trained athlete. So that is the main thing about VO2. This is a very important formula to know. The Fick equation, you'll see it many times. And it's used in the medical community, so if you're into a medical field, you'll see this equation also with cardiac patients. So measured on how high the VO2 is and how high the cardiac output is. The next equation is kind of stupid, but so we'll go over it. He gives Q. Q is also means the same thing as cardiac output. It's just another letter or acronym to memorize, but they're the same thing. But it's Q equals P divided by R. Now P stands for pressure difference. So we'll just say pressure difference. And R stands for resistance. And it's usually resistance in the body. And what this means is vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So it stands for vasoconstrict and vasodilate. If you remember from the beginning of the video, we talked about vasoconstriction and vasodilation, where when you start when you're at rest, all the arteries going to your muscles are vasoconstricted, which decreases blood flow to your muscles, which makes sense because your body doesn't want to really allocate. It only has 5 liters at rest per minute, remember, because cardiac output doesn't really change. Now, it doesn't want to allocate a great percentage of that 5 to your muscles because your muscles really don't need it when you're resting. So it's going to allocate a greater percentage to your kidneys, your liver, your digestive system, those organs that are very active at rest. And of course to your brain and your heart. I guess they're pretty important too. But when you start exercising, your body realizes it needs much more blood going to its muscles, so it's going to vasodilate the arteries to its muscles, so all that blood is now shunted to the muscles which need it at exercise. And vice versa, it's going to realize you don't really need your kidneys, or your liver, or your digestive system when you're exercising, because that's not the focus. So it's going to vasoconstrict those arteries and decrease the blood flow to them, to the less active organs. Now the blood flow to your brains and heart will probably stay the same because you need your brain and heart regardless if you're exercising or if you're in rest. Pretty important. So they won't only change, but resistance refers to the vasoconstriction and vasodilation ratio. So when you start exercising, your resistance will decrease. And resistance is really just the vasoconstriction or resistance of blood flow to the muscles. So when you start exercising, your resistance will decrease. That's just an act of exercising. Now your pressure difference we really don't care about, but if you decrease your resistance, you will increase your cardiac output. We all know this. When you start exercise, you increase your cardiac output, but this is just another way to look at it. It's also increasing because you're decreasing your resistance to your muscles. Now pressure difference only refers to the pressure difference between the arteries and veins, because everything runs by pressure in the body. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the respiratory system, about pressure. But this is talking about blood pressure and the pressure in the arteries and pressure in the capillaries and pressure in the veins. Pressure usually decreases when you get through the body. I don't have a fancy graph to show you, but when you pump out, when you measure someone's blood pressure, which is also another question on, but when you measure someone's blood pressure, the highest number of systolic pressure is how much pressure is in the arteries, or the pressure when the heart's contracting, which also when the heart's contracting, you have blood in the arteries because it pumps blood throughout the arteries. So this is usually 120. So the pressure in the arteries is around 120 systolic blood pressure. Pressure decreases as it goes away from the heart, which makes sense if you think about it. The heart is a pump. It's pumping blood into the arteries. We all know when you pump something, it gets weaker, or when you throw something, whatever, any metaphor you want to use. When you pump something, it gets weaker the farther it gets away from the source. So the farther the blood gets away from the heart, the weaker the pressure, the lower the pressure gets. When the capillaries, pressure is only like 20. When pressure's in the veins, it's only like 0. So pressure decreases as it gets to the heart. So pressure difference is around 120 milligrams of mercury. You really don't need to memorize that number. That's just showing you that pressure generally decreases as it goes throughout the body. As it releases through the artery, we'll draw a better picture, not full of all these words and everything, but I don't have my beautiful heart, so we'll draw my square. But when you pump out blood throughout the aorta, it goes throughout the arteries, goes to the capillaries, gas exchange occurs, goes back to the veins in the superior and inferior vena cava. This is the general blood flow part. Remember, this capillaries is where the AB difference is happening. It's uptaking oxygen. Depending if you're at rest or if you're at exercise, you take up more oxygen. We'll talk about why that is in another video. But when you pump out blood pressure, which we'll talk about much more in depth, is around 120 milligrams of mercury when you pump it out, which makes sense because when your heart, your left ventricle is forcibly going to push out all that blood. And when it does this, it's going to be very high pressure, around 120 milligrams in a healthy individual. Now, as it goes away from the heart, the pressures will decrease from like 100, 80. Now, when it gets to the capillaries, it's like 20. It's very low pressure because the capillaries are very small and very fragile. All this pressure will burst the capillaries. And then as pressure goes back to the heart, it will decrease even more. So when it gets to the heart, it's usually around 0. So this is a pressure difference in the body, 120 minus 0. And this pressure difference, everything in the body follows pressure. High pressure to low pressure, diffusion from anatomy. So because of this pressure difference, blood can easily flow throughout the body. So just know that pressure decreases throughout the body. That would definitely be a very question. That's a very important point to know. You can really predict any questions by if they're medically important. This is medically important, so it's probably going to be a question. Okay, that covers everything about the equations. And we'll go much more in detail about blood pressure and all that stuff in other videos.